The classical view of the church, or denominational churches, is what you call post-tribulational. That is, they believe that the church will get raptured at the end of the tribulation period. That would put it just ahead of the second coming. That view is widely held, has some serious problems. We'll look at a few of them. Among the problems, as I think Kenny Poore once wagged some years ago, he says that makes the marriage supper of the Lamb a snack lunch. You see, because you go up, you're raptured, you have the marriage supper of the Lamb, and you come back down for the second coming. It looks a little strange. If you say post-tribulational views, it turns out part of your difficulty is there's a large number of different views that they argue among themselves. There's no codified view that's post-tribulational. Payne and those guys could be labeled classical post-tribulationalism. Reese and those guys are semi-classic, slight differences. The futuristic post-tribulationists, George Ladd and so forth. And Robert Gundry, dispensational post-tribulation. All these are good guys, they're good scholars, and they love the Lord. That's what makes this area difficult, because these are not evil people. These are not like you're fighting, some kind of deviant cult. At the same time, they have some problems I'll come back to that leave you some of the problems. First of all, each one of these has to deny the New Testament teaching of imminency. We are taught to expect him at any moment. If you're post-tribulation, you've got the whole 70th week of Daniel, you've got the abomination of desolation, you've got all this stuff that has to precede the rapture of the church. That's contrary to all the other teachings, see? It requires the church on the earth during the 70th week. That has all kinds of problems, because Israel and church are mutually exclusive, and that's a whole study in its own right. It also implies that the church experiences God's wrath. We are promised that we wouldn't experience it. 1 Thessalonians 5:9, Romans 3, and Revelation 3:10, and other passages similar to that. And the fundamental problem that bothers me, how can the bride come with him at the rapture? She's got to be raptured first. There's a contradiction there. There are more problems. Who's going to populate the millennium? If the resurrection of the saints, the dead in Christ, and the living believers are raptured at the second coming, and all the unbelievers are wiped out in their judgment, who is going to populate the millennium? Who's left? It sounds funny at first, but it's a real problem. And who are the sheep and goat judgment in Matthew 25? That's asking the same thing another way. How can the virgins of Matthew 25 buy oil without the mark of the beast? That authenticates this whole Jewish wedding model I was saying about earlier. So the post-tribulational thing is the classical adversary to the pre-trib position. But there are those that recognize the church will not go through the tribulation, and they correctly point out that the tribulation is the last half of the week. So they believe that the rapture takes place during the 70th week, but prior to the second half. Well, they can be commended in the sense of that insight, because we obviously agree with that, but at the same time, they also have the church on the earth during the 70th week, and that creates other problems. There is a variant of that view that's created some visibility called the pre-wrath position. The label's unfortunate because all of us would argue, the pre-tribs, the mid-trib, and the would all argue that we're before the wrath, but they've used that as their title. But aside from other problems they have, first of all, they have the rapture taking place 3/4 of the way through the 70th week of Daniel. And so all the rebuttals that apply to the mid-trib would apply to them too. It's tragic here in many respects because the people that we're talking about that are advocating some of these positions are people that love the Lord. They're good scholars. Marv Rosenthal has a marvelous ministry. He's a very terrific writer and leader in many ways. It's unfortunate that he's got hung up, in my opinion, in this deviant view, which has been pretty well, frankly, in my opinion at least, shredded by Stanton, Showers, and most of the writers have done a specific analysis of the position, and it's got self-contradictions. The main problem, without getting into all that here, because I didn't want to spend our time hammering some of those things, is they deny imminency. All these deny imminency, and that I can rest my case there. The pre-trib position argues, most people, you'll notice we do this a little differently. Most people have the pre-trib at the beginning of the 70th week, but that leads to an assumption that's not correct. The rapture does not trigger the 70th week of Daniel. It might, doesn't need to. It might be ahead of that by a little bit, and I'll show you why in a minute. But the pre-trib position is the only one with which you can defend a doctrine of imminency, which is clearly taught all through the New Testament. The rapture precedes the tribulation for several reasons. The 70th week is defined by the covenant of this coming world leader. The Great Tribulation is the last half of that 70th week. The leader cannot be revealed until after the rapture, and the leader has to be the guy that defines it. In other words, the sequence has to be the rapture, the revealing of the leader sets up the 7 years, and then the last half of that 7 years of the tribulation. So the church is removed, not just before the tribulation, but before the 70th week. In fact, the distance between the rapture and the 70th week has to be a distance it could be 1 day, it might be 30 years. It's in that interval between the rapture and the beginning of the 70th week that leader has to emerge publicly, become strong enough to enforce that treaty. That could be a day, could be weeks, could be years, we don't know.